Wilson Schaef is perhaps best known for her books, Women and the New Creation, Women's Reality, An Emerging Female System in a White Male Society, Codependence, Misunderstood, Mistreated, When Society Becomes an Addict, most recently, Escape from Intimacy, and a soon-to-be-published book entitled Women's Work, a meditation book for women who do too much. Almost single-handedly, she has diagnosed the pervasive but subtle systemic addictions that make our society a veritable addictive society. Her insights and writing go beyond diagnosis, however, by suggesting both possibility and process for dealing with those addictions as they afflict both individuals and our society. Dr. Schaef's resume reveals her extensive background as a therapist, lecturer, and consultant to a wide variety of institutions and communities, so wide, in fact, that I won't try to identify all of the types, throughout the United States, Canada, and Europe. That rich background is obviously the database, if you will, for diagnosis and prescriptions in her books, and especially for the illuminating and compelling case stories of codependency and addiction with which she illuminates her perspective. Clearly, Dr. Schaef is uniquely prepared to challenge and advance our understanding of enculturation and the gospel within an addictive American culture. I know that you join me in welcoming her and in anticipating her remarks, so let me present Dr. Ann Wilson Schaef to speak about issues in American culture.
Thank you. That was a nice introduction. If you can't hear me in the back, will you raise your hand, because I tend to start talking to myself after a while. Actually, I don't want to limit myself to American culture, and I want to certainly dwell on American culture. I think it's necessary at this point always to think globally and to realize that we're part of much more than American culture. And certainly the culture that we're in affects the way we view the world and the globe. I suspect that this generation will be known as a generation in search of a paradigm. That we are a people whose paradigm is failing and who have not come upon a new way of looking at ourselves and our world. And I want to share with you some of my own coming to understand that, because actually one of the reasons is I'm working on a book right now about it. So it's right on top of my head. In fact, I have a little anxiety because I left the book in the manuscript in my room. I locked the room. But if there's any fire, I'm leaving here fast. When I'm working on a book, I have this kind of anxious feeling when I'm separated from it, you know. It's called addiction. I also have something in my throat, and I just want to warn you about that. I've been in so many time zones and so many altitudes and climates in the last couple of weeks that my throat doesn't know where I am, so I don't know where it is. In terms of my own background, I certainly was a psychotherapist. I frequently asked to be introduced as a recovering psychotherapist at this point. And as some of you may know, my background also includes seminary and theology. And as I look back at my own growth, from reading the existentialists in the 60s and studying with Buber, Niebuhr, and Tillich and that bunch, and trying to find some answers for myself, I realized that I have always been in search of a paradigm that really made sense to me. And it's interesting to me to note that the paradigm that I think we're leaving now was one that I myself was very involved in and very skilled in, and I feel very good about that because I feel that gives me the ability to leave it. And I think it's sometimes hard to let go of something we never had. It's much harder to let go of something we never had than something we wanted or thought we had. So that's been easy for me. Now we are living out, you can't hear, we are living out in this culture a paradigm that Morris Berman, who is a history and philosophy of science person, would say is reaching its entropic state. That the paradigm that we're living out is one of what some people call the modernist scientific era. A couple of excellent books. One that you would look for in a used bookstore by Morris Berman, because it seems to be out of print, I heard recently, is The Reenchantment of the World. Another by a man named Griffin called The Reenchantment of Science. He's doing it in conjunction with the theological schools at Claremont and the process theology schools, and there are going to be 2 volumes of that, and I think it's very much worth reading. What we are living out is a worldview based on empiricism, mechanistic, Newtonian, Descartesian science. The people who are in the social sciences, and I think also in theology, are much more hooked on that scientific worldview than the classic science like physics. Physics has moved way beyond. But those of us who are in the softer sciences tend to be more hooked by this worldview. Now, this is a worldview, and by the way, Berman does a really good chapter on this in his book of when the church entered in to this scientific worldview and how it has affected the church. And being viewed by a Jewish scholar, I think, is a real interesting perspective to look at. This particular scientific worldview is based on empiricism. It's mechanistic, it's linear, it's rational, it's logical, and it frequently doesn't make any sense at all. Okay? It also is based on the illusion of cause and effect and is very simplistic in the way it looks at cause and effect. And it's also based on the myth of objectivity, which I think is a very important aspect of this. Now, the myth of objectivity requires of us that we live in a non-participatory way in our lives. It requires of us that we remove ourselves from ourselves and make ourselves object to be observed. And that we remove ourselves from the other, whatever the other is, whether it's other people, the planet, nature, whatever. That we remove ourselves from that and make the other something to be observed, controlled, manipulated. So what Berman calls it, and I think I like his words very much, he calls it a non-participatory scientific worldview. Now, one of the hookers of this worldview is that it says that its methodology is the only way to approach truth. And that truth must be approached rationally, logically, and, as he would say in his new book that he's working on, disembodied. Taken out of our body. Now, that is what we have done often with theology. That we have approached our theologizing removing ourselves from our own experience. and from a rational, logical worldview. This worldview is based on intellectual constructs. Am I getting too deep? Are you following me? This is okay? This worldview is based on intellectual constructs that we think up. Therefore, this worldview is an illusionary worldview. It's based on our mental processes of our rational, logical mind, which are illusionary. And whenever our own experience does not agree with the illusion, we are told that our own experience is unreal and that we're sick, bad, crazy, stupid, or one of my friends added, fat, sinful, ugly, and incompetent. So what we have tried to do is we have tried to make ourselves come into connection with, reality with, a reality that is an illusion. And whenever we have tried to present our own reality as we experience it, we have been told that that is illusion. Okay? Now, the best way to divorce yourself from your own reality, your own awareness, and your own knowing is addictions. Because what addictions do is they cut you off from your own knowing. They cut you off from your own awareness. They cut you off from your own feelings. They cut you off from your own truth. And they prepare you to fit into an addictive society, an illusionary world. Now, the person who is best adjusted to an addictive society is the person who is not dead and not alive. Okay? The society needs you to keep it going. But if you're too alive, you can't support the insanity of it. Okay? Now, for me, with my background, which was heavily science, I had majors in chemistry, zoology, and psychology as an undergraduate. And as I look back, I realized that my very favorite course was the only course I had that taught me anything about process. And that was embryology, comparative anatomy, embryology. Because what I learned in science was to stop the process and study it and then believe I knew reality. For example, if I wanted to learn about muscles, I killed a cat. Actually, I didn't have to kill the cat. It was already frozen. But I studied a dead cat. And then there was a belief that I would know muscles in cat. Well, I knew about a dead cat. Okay. In embryology, we froze things. We did serial cross-sections at various stages of development. But the stages of development that we studied showed us what happened as the embryo developed. And we could follow each germ mass as it went through its developmental process. And we could even sometimes see that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. Not often, but sometimes. And as I look back, I realized that that was the course that I just ate up. because everything else was teaching me something static and trying to give me tools for making a process universe stop and become static and live under an illusion of control. Okay, are you following me? Okay. Now, the piece that began to make sense for me, I mean, a lot of things have made sense for me along the way. Actually, let me just share with you a couple of things that are asides. When I talked about our theologizing and our theorizing being very logical and rational and not making any sense, I have reached a point in my own recovery and in my own development where many of the things that I used to do I can't stand anymore. And I am fairly obnoxious because not only can I not stand them in me, but I have real difficulty standing them in other people. And I was on a panel recently with 3 people whom I admire very much and like very much and would very much like for them to like me. They did at the beginning of the panel. I think that has changed somewhat. And what I'm trying to do is to share my own coming to this knowledge and coming to this awareness and coming to what I can no longer do, and to share that and to try to say why I can no longer do some of these things. And one of the things that I said that I can no longer comfortably do, I feel like it threatens my own sobriety, my own clarity, my own spirituality to do this, because I equate my process, my sobriety, and my spirituality. My recovery has been from relationship addiction, with relationship addiction. I'm not an alcoholic, but I certainly use the 12-step program of Alcoholics Anonymous in my own recovery from relationship addiction. My guess is about 90% of the room would share this addiction with me, and that may be a low estimate. Anyway, I've said that one of the things that I can no longer do is make interpretations, because I have come to a place where for me to make an interpretation throws me into my illusion of control, my disrespect for other people, etc., etc. So I personally can no longer do that. And the panel took umbrance with that, and actually in a very vocal way. And one of the incidents that happened was someone asked 2 of the panel members who are very into the birthing process, well, don't you think that the birthing process is very important? And I know you emphasize that in your work, et cetera, et cetera. And one of them said, absolutely, life is reliving our birth process. That's what life is. And we go through that and through it and through it at different levels. And it's very important to have the information about your birthing process so that you can understand it as you're going through it again and again and again. Well, I thought that reduced life to somewhat of a simple process. But I didn't jump up at that one. Then she said, for example, take the cesarean, the person who is born cesarean. That person, now hear how logical and rational this is. That person never confronts the birth process. So that person tends to be non-confrontive in life and to not deal with life and to be fairly passive with life and not be confrontive of other people. I was born cesarean. And here I was out there confronting everything I was hearing. And I said, I can't stand this. This is the kind of thing I just go nuts with. Because what you're saying is logical and rational. Your mind is just as busy as can be. But it doesn't make any sense. And it is so seductive. I could see the people in the audience going, little drools coming down the side of their mouth. Because it makes us think we understand, and then we don't have to participate in it. It makes us think we know what's going on, and then we can miss life. We don't have to do the living. We can remove ourselves from the living and think about it. And that's what this addictive system, or this scientific modern system, asks us to do. Now, in an addictive system, we remove ourselves from ourselves, and we make ourselves objects to be observed. What began to make sense for me as I began to learn about addiction and to see that I was indeed a part of this addictive process, and began to do my own recovery, to do and work my own recovery work, to face addiction. What happened was I made a shift in my perception. I made a paradigm shift. The thing that I was aware of on that panel was that everybody that I was on this with whom I never can get that right. All those people with whom I was on that panel are big names in the field of addiction. Big names. What I realized as I was up there is not one of them is doing their own recovery, which is very prevalent. What I realized in my own work was that if I was going to learn about addictions, I had to go in it. And I didn't even have the name at that point, the language, but that I had to go into it in a participatory way. That I had to fully participate in my own recovery and in facing my own addictive process, or that there was no way I could understand it. Now, each of us has been trained in that addictive process. It is part of our society. It is part of the worldview out of which we come. The scientific worldview out of which we come demands addiction in order for us to survive in society the way it is. I can remember one time I was speaking at in Evanston, and the campus minister said to me, "Do you think what you're talking about is what Jesus called principalities and powers?" And I said, "I think so. I think so." Now, in an addictive society, we all learn the addictive process. It is the norm for the society. I think of the addictive process as very much like an underground river. That it has its channel, it has its course. And when that course is blocked, it finds another way. I have never met anybody with only one addiction. Some old-time AA folks like to think if they're not drinking, that's all they need to worry about. But even Bill W. said that's just the beginning. Some of his last writings were about the need to change our entire way that we look at the world and we live in it. and the way that we relate and love with each other. What happens with this addictive process is it'll change and come out in different forms in different situations or in different ways that we live our life. The addictive process is learned, and I think this is very important. It is not the normal state for the human organism. So you're always having to fight your own reality, your own awareness, your own knowing, in order to stay in that addictive process. Anything that's learned can be unlearned. I think of our training in the addictive society as like we have this core, what I call our living process. Some of you might call it our relationship with God, whatever you want to call it, our spirituality. We have this core, and it gets covered over by the addictive process in the society, layer after layer after layer after layer. We learn it in our homes. We learn it in our schools. We learn it in our churches. We learn it in our government. We get so layered over with this addictive process that we lose contact with even the knowing that this core is there. And we begin to think of our addictive process as who we are. One of the important things that is said in a 12-step program is you have a disease, you are not your disease. That's very important to remember. We have learned this disease. We are not this disease. This disease can take many forms. Now, the elements of this disease are dishonesty. Now, I used to think, before I started my recovery, that I was not dishonest. In fact, I'm a pretty honest person, bluntly honest often. I get in a lot of trouble for my honesty. I found that it was much easier for me to be honest about other people than it was myself. It's what I now call Esalen honesty. I think that you. And the subtlety of our dishonesty, I think, can be quite alarming. For example, I often find in those that are trained in religious vocations that our dishonesty focuses on not being honest about who we are and where we are. Not being honest about our own needs. Not listening to our own body. Not being aware of ourselves. And trying to maintain an illusionary, dishonest image and present it to ourselves and the public. I call that the girdle syndrome. We buy the girdle a few sizes too small, and then we try to fit ourselves into it. We try to predetermine who we are and what we should be like. I have one friend who's a nun, and one of the things that she decided that would be a part of being a perfect nun would be when you, I'm sure some of you have learned this, by the way, that when you walked, it looked like you were floating. So that it never looked like you had to do the human thing of walking. You just sort of, and it was much easier when you had the habit, of course. But you could kind of float down the corridor. And she's given floating lessons to our... And I almost got it, by the way. I thought that if I just got the proper gown and learned this floating technique that I might be able to do guru-ritis. But I'm too earthy for it, I think. But we all do that, and that's a form of dishonesty. Impression management is a form of dishonesty. Impression management. Now, again, for those of you who have gone through formation, which sounds very much like a girdle, doesn't it? Part of that process traditionally has been to get you out of touch with who you are. Now think of the disrespect of that worldview. Because what that says is who you are doesn't have anything good to offer. So you have to become other than who you are in order to offer anything. That's a form of dishonesty. That is part of the addictive system. What I have learned from my own recovery is that any time that I slip into any little dishonesty, it flips me back into my addictive process. So that it's real important to me to keep honest. Now, on that panel, I was the fourth person to speak. People teased me about my body language. I was trying to be polite. And I was sitting there going nuts. You know, I was just... And I sat there and thought, if I say what I'm thinking and what I'm feeling, I'm going to lose 3 people who thought they were my friends. And I couldn't sit there, and I thought, if I don't say my reaction to this, I'm being dishonest. That's dishonesty. Now, I don't need to puke it on them. I don't need to beat them up. I need to share my own response and what I can deal with. Dishonesty permeates the society. Have you ever watched our political leaders on television? I can remember when Reagan was running for office, and it could have been anyone. I do pick on Reagan a lot, but I like to pick on anybody. You can't hear me again. I dropped. You're right. I can remember when Reagan was running for office, and I never watched television, so I, in some ways, don't keep up with the culture. But I was in a condo up in Maine doing a workshop, and they had a television. I thought, well, I'll listen to the political, whatever going on politically. It was during the campaign. And they had these political ads, where they came on and they talked to you. Well, I was really impressed with Ronnie's eye contact, I mean, here he is looking me eyeball to eyeball. I thought, how can you do that with 1 million people? I mean, I was real impressed. So I pulled up the chair right close, and I just listened with our eyes staying in contact all the time. And what happened was I began to feel tension in my solar plexus. Now, I know me well enough to know that when I feel tension in my solar plexus, that is frequently because I'm being lied to. That is where my lie indicator is. Now, think about it. Where do you know when you're being lied to? It's not in your brain, is it? You feel it first, and then you try to bring it up to your brain and figure out what it is. But it doesn't start there. Now, what our addictions do is they cut off our inner information system so that we don't get that information. Now, when I tuned into my solar plexus, I said, my heavens, this man is lying right through his teeth. I was there alone, but I turned around and said, do you see that? Do you see that? He's lying. And then I had this terrible realization. And it was that the majority of people that he had eye contact with also had cut off their internal information system and didn't let themselves know that they were being lied to. That we learn to do that in an addictive society, and we think if we let ourselves know that we couldn't stand it. And yet what we can't stand is not letting ourselves know our own truth, our own reality. So what happens when we're out of touch with that, we're dishonest with the world in one form or another. Another characteristic of an addictive system is the illusion of control. The belief that it's possible to control other people. Our political systems are based on the illusion of control. Our religious systems are based on the illusion of control. Any system that's based on the illusion of control is by definition an addictive system. I have an article coming out in Christian Century soon. The title is a rhetorical question. Is the church an addictive organization? I think it answers itself, but I answer it well. I think. I was surprised they agreed to publish it. They asked me to write it, but they with the proviso that they might not take it. And I wrote it the way I wanted to say it, and they took it. I've always admired the Christian Century. Now I admire them even more, I think. We'll see. We'll see. Another characteristic of an addictive system is the illusion of perfection. That's the Gödel syndrome. That's predefining what you should be like and trying to get there, so that perfection is always seen as something other than what you are and who you are. Another characteristic of an addictive system is self-centeredness. Now, self-centeredness is more than just selfishness. It includes that, but it's more than that. Self-centeredness is putting yourself the center of the universe and defining everything else from your perception. Our missionary work has been a good example of this. For example, of defining our universe as reality and trying to make every other reality conform to ours and not respecting other people's. Now, self-centered people tend to have no boundaries. They not only don't know where they end and others begin, they don't know that they end and others begin. Because of that, self-centered people very often get into control, because everybody is a threat to their own reality. If you don't have your own boundaries and you don't know who you are and where you end and where you begin, everybody is a threat to your reality. So you have to try to control everybody else. This is what we have done as a nation. This is what we have done, I think, in most of our institutions. Now, self-centered people, this is a theological issue. Self-centered people assume they are God. Because when you put yourself as the center of the universe and you define everything else in terms of yourself, that is assuming to be God. And then you try to control the universe from that perspective. Let me give you an example of this. It was done in jest, and I loved it. I'm not Catholic. I was raised as a Southern Methodist. Some real good points to that, mostly the gospel hymns, which I love. Can't hear me again. Not a Catholic. We have a sister of Loretto that lives in our household. When she moved in, I said, I'm not a Catholic, I'm a Protestant. like I said, I'm not sure how much I know about Catholicism and the Catholic Church, but I'm sure open to learning. And she said, "My dear, there are no such things as Protestants. There are Catholics and non-Catholics." If she had not been saying it in jest, she would not still be living there. But I think it's a very good example of self-centeredness, of viewing the world this way as self-centeredness. Now, these are just a few of the characteristics. Well, let me just mention a couple of others. One is what AA calls stinkin' thinking. Addictive thinking processes, as I said, are very logical and very rational. They frequently don't make any sense. They are often circular in the way they go. If you think of some arguments you've been in, of course, probably none of you get in them, but I do. Frequently, those are addictive thinking processes. AA is very honest about those processes. They call them stinkin' thinking. In an addictive system, confusion is the norm. When you find yourself trying to figure out what's going wrong, 99% of the time you can just assume that you're dealing in an addictive system. Interesting, isn't it? Think of how much time we spend trying to figure out what's going on. We find this when we consult with addictive organizations, that many of the people in addictive organizations are always trying to find out what's going on. Our perception is frequently nothing is. But there is a belief that something is. Now, I believe that we need to learn about addictions in order to fully understand what's going on in our lives, in our society. The only way to really learn about addictions is to do our own recovery. And what we have seen is, for example, the family that has no chemical dependency whatsoever, but has a workaholic parent, has exactly the same family dynamics as the family who has an active alcoholic or drug addict. That when people flip into their workaholism, they become just as disrespectful, destructive, controlling, emotionally violent as an alcoholic. Now, I mention workaholism because I think in this particular group you might want to check that out. Okay? When people get addicted to their religion, they exhibit the same kind of characteristics that we see in the active alcoholic. That the addictive process itself can take many forms. And when we flip into that process, we act like an addict, and it doesn't matter what the addiction is. In the new book that was mentioned, Escape from Intimacy, one of the addictions that I talk about is romance addiction. And romance addicts are not just people who are involved in romantic relationships. The romance addict is the person who is addicted to the illusion, whatever the illusion is. Romance addicts are frequently people who are addicted to causes or people who are addicted to suffering. You might want to check those out. I don't know whether any of you saw the movie Teresa. What a beautiful example of addiction to suffering in that film. And the beauty of suffering. I have come to think of war as a national romance addiction. the glory of dying for your country, the beauty of giving up your life for something, is a romance addiction. Most addicts find it much easier to give up their life for something than to live it. Think about it. Now, what we have done, I think very often in the church and very often in my old field of psychotherapy, what we have done is we have focused on only one aspect of our reality. Can you see this? Pretty well, okay? This is time on the bottom. I'll read it for you, okay? This is intensity. You don't need to really see it because I'll read it for you, but it makes me feel so secure to put it up, okay? And with families, and now on a larger global level, that when we first begin to face some of these issues, most of our time is spent in the addictive process. That we have been so well trained in that process that we live out of that addictive process most of the time. We live out of our illusion of control, our illusion of objectivity, our illusion of perfectionism, our dishonesty, our self-centeredness, our crazy, confused thinking. We live out of that. When we first begin to recover, much of our time is spent in that. We also always have a living process that's there. I have yet to meet anybody, I don't care how sick or crazy or violent even they have been, I have yet to meet anybody who doesn't still have a living process. Sometimes it's pretty buried, but I've never not found it to be there. This is early recovery. It takes 2 to 5 years of hard work. It may be 2 to 5 years before a person has their first experience of sobriety or their first experience of really knowing their spirituality, not thinking about it, but knowing it, feeling it. Very often, for a lot of people, the first time they really experience their spirituality, not what they think is their spirituality or not their concept of spirituality, but their spirituality. Very often, the first time they experience it, it scares them to death. It's like a meteorite that goes through their consciousness. And the response is, what was that? And you try to get control. Back into the disease as soon as possible. Then what happens is, as that spirituality, as your living process, begins to come out as you peel off the layers of your addiction, what happens is that time and frequency expands so that you may have 5 seconds, 10 minutes of clarity. Then what we do in true addictive fashion is we say, this is not nothing, this is something. How do I make it happen? And we think, what did I have on when I felt that? I'll put on the same clothes. How was I standing? How was I sitting? What was I doing? How can I ritualize my spirituality, my process? And we try to control it and make it happen. And when we do that, we're in our disease. Okay? Now, Diane Fassel, who wrote The Addictive Organization with me, in working with all organizations, has said, there is no, there's a whole new movement as organizational transformation right now. She has said there's no transformation without recovery. Now, I think this is true in many fields, in what I call the New Age pookie. Trying to transform. If you just hang yourself with enough crystals, and if you just, we can see it, the form change, but, we see the content change, but the form stays pretty much the same, the way we do it. If we just do enough of whatever it is we're supposed to do, then we're going to transform. But we want to do it in a lazy fashion. We want to do it without having to do our own recovery. We want to do it. We want to find all these transformative things without facing that we are indeed part of the addictive system and need to face our own addictive process. And that the only way to do that is in a participatory fashion. You can't do it intellectually. You have to do your own recovery. Conversely, there is no recovery without transformation. That one of the big obstacles to recovery in this society is we believe that if we recover, we'd have to give up everything. So we're not willing to do it. Now, doesn't that sound familiar? Being willing to give up everything? Now, the paradox is, of course, if you're willing to give up everything, you may not have to. But if you're going to be willing so you don't have to, that's your disease. Now, what I am finding is when the 12-step program says, if you want to recover, you have to be willing to put your sobriety first. You have to be willing to let go of your children, your mate, your house, your income, your church, whatever. You have to be willing. Because anything that is an obstacle to your sobriety keeps you out of touch with your spirituality. Anything that is an obstacle to your sobriety has become a false god. And I think there was something about having no other gods before me, wasn't there? Now, in the living process system, to me, there are two passages that connect a lot with that. One is, I come to bring you life. Remember that one? We have focused so much on non-living that life scares us. What does it mean to live your life? What does it mean that there is nobody else in the universe with your chromosomes, your genes, and your experience? See, I think of the world, the universe, as a great puzzle. And that each of us is a piece of that puzzle. When you try to live someone else's life, or impression management, or what you think you should be, you're not living your own life, and there's a hole in the universe. We have reached a place, I believe, where there are a critical number of holes in the universe. The new sciences talk about a holographic universe, or a hollow movement universe, as David Bohm talks about, where we are the universe and we are also ourselves. And there is no separation. Sounds like the oneness. that some of us hear about in different spiritualities, that we are all one. The other passage that I like so much that I think relates to the living process system is, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock." Now, when we are living out of our addictions, we don't even see the door, much less hear the knock. Because one of the advantages of addictions is that they shut off our awareness and our perceptions. When we open ourselves to our own process and ourselves, we begin to hear that knocking, and we begin to see those doors. Then the issue, of course, is, are you willing to walk through them? And that's up to you. Now, this is not just an individual issue. What I am seeing happen in the field of addictions is very interesting. I am seeing, as I work in this throughout the world, I am seeing more and more people claiming, confronting, and starting recovery from their addictions. I was just in Russia in April. I was invited over there by the Russian Peace Commission to speak on the addictive society. They were very excited about these ideas, and they said, which just brought tears for me, they said, what you are talking about is what perestroika and glasnost is about. That we are willing to look at every aspect of our society and see what isn't working and why. And if it's an addictive system, we're willing to look at it. I haven't heard that in the U.S. yet. But what I'm seeing is that we have more and more individuals who are in the process of recovery from their addictive process. 12-step groups are proliferating like crazy. People are going, they're changing. In the Native American community, there is a tremendous emphasis now on recovery. The awareness that alcohol has almost destroyed their faith. There's one beautiful documentary film called The Honor of All about a Native American community in Canada that went from 100% alcoholism to 95% sobriety. Marvelous things are happening. I think we are reaching, approaching a critical mass in people who are actively in recovery, who are not thinking about addictions and et cetera, but who are doing it. And that participation is different. What is happening is that then families are starting to recover. Now, it's interesting that some of the people in the family therapy field are stuck here. They say, well, if the individual recovers and the family recovers, that's all we need to worry about. So they draw a line here. And I believe the reason that line is drawn is to support our massive denial system about the addictive functioning in organizations and in societies. If we can just keep it to the individual and the family, we don't have to see the immensity of the problem. I think we have to move beyond this line. What is happening, which I think is fascinating, is that as individuals are in recovery and as families are in recovery, they are finding that they can't tolerate their sick, addictive organizations. And as I travel around, I can't tell you the number of people who say to me, my workplace is threatening my sobriety. Now, what are these people doing? They're leaving. They're leaving their organizations. The churches need to look at this tremendously. Because what they're saying is, being there threatens my sobriety, and if I have to put my sobriety first, I have to leave. There's nothing else for me to do. Very often, business-wise, they're starting their own entrepreneurial efforts. If they don't leave, frequently the organization gets rid of them. Because we have found that organizations self-select into them individuals that have their same level of pathology. And if the level of pathology begins to change in the individual, the organization gets threatened and tries a way to get rid of that individual. They are getting rid of the very people who could bring about the change that they say they want. Okay? Now, I don't think that's by accident that organizations are right in the middle of this diagram. Because I believe that the addictive organization is like the infrastructure that's holding together the addictive individual and family and the addictive society and globe. It's like the skeleton that keeps the body upright. What we are seeing more and more, and I am seeing firsthand, is that addiction is a global problem. That the very processes that are related to cutting down our rainforests, the holes in the ozone, acid rain, water contamination, air contamination, those very processes go back to addictive thinking and addictive functioning. Addicts, frequently said of addicts, they do not learn from their experience because they have no memory. Addicts always go for the short-range goal. They don't see the implications for the future. We are seeing this on a global level. I have a very good friend from Africa, from Tanzania. She is now facing her own alcoholism and looking at that. And I said, what's going on in Africa with respect to recovery and dealing with addiction? She said, nothing. And she said, but I'll tell you what's happening. She said, our native people who are the educated intellectuals, she loves that word, the intellectuals of our particular countries, she said, are being killed off. She said, you would not believe the percentage of our educated intellectual African people who are dying in automobile accidents related to drunken driving. And I just got a letter from her because as she's been thinking about this, she's becoming more and more angry. She said, you know, our banana beer we always had in our villages, we had someone, usually a woman, who tasted and checked out the alcohol content when we were brewing banana beer for celebrations and things. But she says now we've added vodka, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And what's happening is we are losing our leaders to automobile accidents, drunken driving. This is a global problem. The addictive process, the addictive system is a global problem. For me, it has been the best way to get a handle on what's really going on. When we look at it from that paradigm, it makes more sense to me than any other way I've looked at it. The other thing that's exciting to me is, as they say in the 12-step program, this is the only fatal disease from which recovery is guaranteed if you do your work. Now, as one minister who's a recovering overeater said to me, he says, you know, right now in history, I think there's more spirituality in the church basement than in the sanctuary. It has often been said, and is becoming more frequently said, that the 12-step program is probably the major thing that's happening in the late 20th century. Interesting to think about. I know I'm getting time. I know I'm over time. Okay? Yes. I can hear you. Can the rest of you hear? No, try the microphone.
My question is one of clarification, I think. You're talking about the paradigm that we're trying to get rid of, which addresses or speaks to the fact that what we perceive is not really what we perceive. And then you spoke about self-centeredness, which is, what I heard was seeing reality out of our experience. So I don't know.
Oh no, it's putting ourself in the center of the universe. One of the women who trained with me, I think, said something that to me was absolutely brilliant. She said, "When I am in my self-centeredness, I am out of touch with myself."
Could you give me an example of how that would look different?
For example, when I am in my self-centeredness and I'm giving a speech and someone stands up and walks out, I say, they don't like what I'm saying. I relate it to me. Okay? When I am in my sobriety, I notice it, and I say, maybe they don't like what I'm saying. Maybe they have to go to the bathroom. I don't know what's going on with them. Yeah. But so what happens is I start referencing outside myself, and I lose myself. And then I get more controlling and try to set up the universe from that kind of illusionary perception. Yeah, right. So stay here. Okay. Yes.
You spoke about the paradigm we are leaving. Would you say something about the paradigm that we might embrace?
Okay, I spoke about the paradigm that we're leaving when I say something about the paradigm that we might embrace. Always when there's a question like that, like what should we be doing? It's like, I always think there's the girdle syndrome, so I'm nervous about that. And what I'm learning is that, actually, let me say, what I have come into is in my work, as I have done step by step my own changes, I have discovered I'm operating out of a different paradigm. Then I found some writing that seemed to be saying the same thing. And the best writing that I have found is a physicist named David Bohm, B-O-H-M. And he's absolutely impossible to read. There's a book that I think is a good introduction that if you pick and choose carefully the writings in it, called The Holographic Paradigm. David Bohm talks about a holographic universe, a hollow movement, and he goes in implicate order and all that. I can't even understand what he's talking about. But what he talks about, from my own knowing, is that I know when I am sober and when I am living out of my process, I'm in touch with it, that I have moments of the experience of oneness with all things. And that when I am living out of my process is God. And God is more than my process. But I am one with that. And I can't control that. It's like a state I already have that I have left. I mean, it really is what a lot of the major spiritual paths of the world talk about. And that paradoxically, I am an individual. And I am also the universe. And when I live out of my living process, when I don't cover it over with my addictions, I am aware of that process of the universe. Now, as I read people like David Bohm and Karl Pribram and some of these thinkers, what is real clear to me is that our whole scientific worldview is going to have to change. And the scientific method, the ways that we have been taught to approach reality have to change. And I don't think we fully know what that means yet. But we have made major paradigm shifts, in recorded history. And I think we're on the verge of one. And one of the beauties of this paradigm shift is that you have to do it to know it. Because it's a participatory worldview. You have to fully participate. And one of the things that's so exciting to me about the 12-step program and people who are actively recovering from addictions is it's one of the few models that we have of a totally participatory, non-hierarchical program that works. In that program, the people who are most trusted are not the authorities. The people who are most trusted are people who themselves have the disease and are working on their own recovery. They're one with. So it's a totally different model than most of us have learned. Yes?
Let me just ask you to spell it out a little bit. What would it look like to be a non-addictive church?
I might get into my romance addictions. Well, for example, let me just give you just a couple of examples. In this new book of mine on escape from intimacy, one of the things that I got into that I hadn't planned to in that book, and that's one of the reasons I enjoy writing, is you always get into something you don't plan to as you write. And because I had planned a section on sex addiction, romance addiction, and relationship addiction to show how the various institutions of the society support these addictions. But as I got into the book, I started thinking about what it would look like if a critical mass of people recovered from each of these addictions. For example, imagine sex addiction. What would it look like if vast numbers of people recovered from sex addiction? What would happen to advertising? We wouldn't be able to sell cars without sex addiction. One of the women who trained with me works in the ski industry, and she said that she didn't think they'd be able to sell ski boots and ski costumes without sex addiction because that's our soul. But one of my questions was, what would happen to the church if masses of people recovered from sex addiction? If you listen to the speeches of our major international leaders, much of what they focus on is sex addiction, and certainly sexism of one form or another. What would the church do if it didn't focus on sex? What would the church do if it didn't make sex the most important aspect of a relationship? It might have time for spirituality, for example. What would the church do if it didn't operate out of its illusion of control? What would the church do if it shared the good news and let it go? Part of what we see in an addict is so unsure of their own validity and their own self-esteem that they have to try to control everybody else into their reality. What would the church do if it believed that the gospel could stand on its own feet? And it shared it and lived out of it and trusted that the witnessing of the way we live our own lives would be enough. What would the church do if its organizational structure was set up in such a way as to facilitate what it says it's about, instead of to interfere with it? Okay? Those are just a few. Yes?
I hesitate to take our minds off of what you just said, but I will. When you talked about the self-centeredness that is typical of the addict.
Mm-hmm.
As a recovering person in more than one 12-step program, it seems to me that recovery certainly can seem extremely self-centered, and certainly your family is the first one to point that out to you. And also, as our people who are new in recovery, they say, what is the difference between this and what the me generation is saying? I've heard people say that if I recover, that's best for me and for everyone around me, and yet to say that to someone outside of the program sounds horrible. They say you're being self-centered. Can you speak to that?
Yes. Well, one of the things I know from my own recovery is I overdid it a bit early on. That my disease is one of relationship addiction, and I decided that I was never going to enable anybody else ever again. And I think that's part of early recovery. And I think when we don't see recovery as a process, we expect people to be full-blown, and it's a process. That's one aspect of it. I also know from my own experience that as people begin to live their own process, they respect the process of other people and support that process by default, not because they're trying to, not because they think they should, but because it just comes naturally. Now, I think what happens is when we decide that we should care for other people, love other people, et cetera, we usually don't. I mean, if you would hear the horror stories that I have heard over the years at the intensives I do from people who were educated by nuns, I mean real horror stories. And what I know is, and this is not just true of nuns, but it's true of all of us, what I know is that when we don't live our own process, we puke it on someone else. That if we don't do our own process work and live our own process, we puke it on someone else. And that frequently comes out in one or another form of violence. Again, I think of war as nations puking their process on each other. That they aren't doing their own process, so they puke it on each other. So what I have seen is that early in recovery, it looks selfish. And what I've also seen, that people who are really doing their recovery are serving in a way that's clear and not controlling and not disrespectful, in a way that we don't see when we intellectualize serving and then try to do it. Okay? Yes.
I have a question for you. I've worked in the addiction field off and on since the early 70s, middle 70s. And at that time, the majority of the people involved in treating addiction of any kind had to be working the program or working their own recovery in order to be working there. And what began to happen was the organizational thing you mentioned. The organizations began to dictate what it was required in order to help people. Mm-hmm. And when insurance companies got involved, it then became a thing of quality.
When it became big business.
Yes.
Yes.
There's gold in the
That's right.
And one of the things that is happening increasingly is I'm hearing from people who are actually practicing their recovery that they cannot stay in the organizations anymore. And I'm hearing more and more people who are qualified say that they don't have to practice recovery in order to treat addicts. They just have to introduce addicts to the program and send them to meetings and stuff. I have not found a way to explain to people who are qualified and certified and everything else why it is important for them to practice what they're trying to teach to addicts.
Listen, I have a panel for you.
Do you have any suggestions? Because it's like this dead-end wall, you run into all the time. And usually what happens is whoever's trying to say that gets their inventory taken real well. Mm-hmm. What's still wrong with them?
Mm-hmm. Yes, one of them did take my inventory.
But is there any way that you know of to explain to people why it's really important for them to recover in order to share recovery?
Well, that's what I'm trying to do in this book that I'm working on now. it's called Beyond Science, Beyond Therapy. And one of the things that I'm going to talk about there is what I call the medico-centric view of the universe and the scientifico-centric view of the universe. And you're absolutely right. I see this happening all over, that as addiction is big money and it's become popular, it more and more is being taken over by the professions, etc. And they're seeing that there's no need for recovery. All I do is keep saying this and try not to take their inventory. And that's hard. That's real hard. And one of the things that I had hoped for is that this critical mass of people who are in recovery and are also professionals, like myself, and there are quite a few, who can then speak to this whole thing. What I'm finding is, this disease is cunning, baffling, powerful, and patient. And what I'm finding is that a lot of people start their recovery, professionals, but then when it conflicts with their professional training wins out. And that's what I'm trying to write about. And I find it very difficult. When I wrote Women's Reality, an emerging female system in a white male society, when I talked about that stuff for 15 years before I wrote it. And I frequently had the experience of I'd be talking about women's reality and the way we see the universe. And some, usually man, but sometimes a woman, would say to me, I know exactly what you're talking about. And I knew in my gut that they didn't. And I would say, no, you don't. And they would say, yes, I do. And I would say, repeat for me what I'm saying. And they would repeat what they were saying, and I'd say, that's not it. And they would say, yes, it is. Now, at that point in my own life, I said to myself, what is this preparing me for? And what it's preparing me for is facing a nation of addicts. Another thing that I have had a great deal of difficulty with recently, I finally have worked my process and understand, I have just been feeling this horrendous sadness when I would see anything about the 60s and the civil rights issues. I went to see Mississippi Burning. Didn't especially want to go see it because I heard it wasn't a very good movie, and I just got into deep sobs during that movie. And what I've realized is that in the 60s, I was on the front lines, really putting my life down for civil rights. In the late 60s and 70s, I was on the front lines for feminism, really putting myself my life on the line. Now that I see how all of this relates to addiction, and I have the same fervor with, another piece of truth to add on to what I've learned from civil rights and feminism. And what I expected, expectations is part of the disease, what I expected was my black brothers and sisters and my feminist sisters to be right beside me marching. And they're attacking me. And what they're saying is, hey, I want to get in the system, and I want to get what the system has to give me, and I don't want to hear about my own addictions. And I'm really looking at that. So, people don't like to look at their addictions. And I think it's the only way to work your own recovery is the only way to truly make a paradigm shift. So, I don't know how to take it. I just keep putting it out there and letting it go. And that's the key, letting it go.
I teach New Testament texts, and as I've been working my own process of recovering, I find very deep associations, especially with Paul's view of the spiritual journey, power and weakness, and those themes. And I'm just, as I think about this whole area, I wonder if we are not naming again what classical theology has talked about as the effects of original sin, and that we are touching into, as we touch into this reality individually and collectively, we are finding new language to speak about the effects of original sin, the need for grace, the need for God, for the higher power. And I'm just wondering whether the loss of this language and the loss of this in our culture has been one of the ways in which we have gotten out of touch with things that might help us out of our tradition in the recovery process, and whether recovering some of these deeper symbols in our tradition might serve us along this way that we are now opening up out of our human experience. I'm just wondering whether you would have a comment.
Certainly, I think addictions and estrangement from God are the same. And as we look at original sin, one of my concerns with that is the judgmental component, and judgmentalism is part of the addictive system. Another is that is normal for the human organism, and I'm not sure I believe that. I'm not sure I believe addictions are normal for the human organism. Another concern I have is that the vehicle, and I think this is why so many people have so much pain in relation to the church, is that the vehicle that promised to bring us the good news is itself not only cohabitating with, but supporting and acting out of the addictive process. So that the news is true for all of us. And the way it's conveyed and the vehicle out of which it's comes is frequently antithetical to what it's saying. So I think that, that we really need to look at that. Certainly the beauty of the 12-step program or any recovery program is its spiritual base, which we have moved out of. It's also real important in that recovery to look at morality, not in terms of a predefined, rigid morality, but your own morality as you know it and as you have left it. And I think that has been an area of conflict for a lot of people with the church, because the church talks about morality and is immoral. So I think that's been a confusion to even use the information of traditional spirituality in the church.
I would agree with you.
Last one.
My effort is to get back to the story. Walter Brueggemann spoke yesterday about the story of the Old Testament, and I about the story of the New Testament, so that story can be told to the church itself. In other words, to separate the story from the institution. The institution being this is a large topic, and
Thank you. I think that has to be the last one I hear. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Schaef, for a wonderful presentation. And I'd like to invite the audience. There is coffee in the lobby, and we return at 11 o'clock for Dr. Evelyn Whitehead's presentation.